So let me tell you about one of my running adventures. This was up in the northeast of England, up in the Newcastle and Sunderland area. I had an idea, and this was based upon the London Underground run that I'd done a couple of years beforehand. And I thought, could I do the same sort of thing as the Underground, but in the northeast of England? I thought that might be a really cracking adventure. And what spurred me on is that during the period just before the adventure, I started to get in contact with an organisation called the Adventure Queens, who prompt and they encourage women to get involved in their own adventures that they've devised and that they've developed and that they execute themselves. And they have women doing all sorts of adventures. But I managed to get a grant from them. And what the grant allowed me to do is to actually do this adventure, because what I'd done in the past is I'd done single day solo journeys unsupported, and I had enough of the very basic equipment, the like running clothes, running trainers and what have you. But the Adventure Queens gave me a grant towards getting gear from a company called Arc'teryx. Now, they're a very expensive outdoor clothing company, and their stuff is absolute top-notch, lightweight stuff. And it made the difference between me being able to carry around my gear just from one day to carrying my gear for 2 days. And with the grant that I got through Arc'teryx is that I got a very lightweight, state-of-the-art waterproof for my top half, and I also got a very, very lightweight running puffer. In essence, it's like a lightweight coat, and both of those things you could scrunch up into little balls and then put in your backpack. So it enabled me to carry around stuff in a lightweight fashion, and that's a game changer between doing day solo supported adventures and multi-day, which I'll tell you more about in a bit. And the other game changer was that I also got a grant through the Adventure Queens as well, from a company called Osprey, and through them I got a lovely running backpack with the 2 soft flasks, and it had space in the back for putting all my kit for the overnight adventure. Now, both of these things, both of the grants through Arc'teryx and Osprey, I wouldn't have been able to afford that gear. And at that point in time, I was in a job that would not have allowed me to financially support this type of adventure. So it actually gave me a bit of a helping hand towards the adventuring that I'm doing day to day now. So I have a big thank you towards the Arc'teryx and the Osprey and the Adventure Queens. Okay, that aside, check them out online. But that aside, let me move back to my adventure. So the plan was this: I was going to run around every single metro station in the northeast, and that runs from Newcastle Airport in the northwest, just above Newcastle City, and it snakes all the way around to the coast towards Teignmouth or Tynemouth. I'm not entirely sure of the pronunciation to this day. Back down towards Newcastle City, snaking a little bit around the centre before crossing the river, and then out along the south bank towards Sunderland, towards the coast again, and then back inland to the finish at Southampton. So my plan, that was my plan. And so it takes a lot of ingenuity to try to piece them all together, to try and get the shortest route round that quite frankly wasn't going to kill you and was actually feasible. And now I set out to do a route that was 66 miles, so that's 100 kilometres for those who may work in kilometres. So yeah, 66 miles is what I got it down to. There were some routes which I think were getting into the 70s, 80s, but I just knew that as a first off multi-day adventure, that was not going to work for me. Because the longest I'd ever done before was, I think it was late 40s. Yeah, it's about around about late 40s, maybe 50 for a single day. Yeah, so for me 66 really was all I wanted to push it out to, because technically I could have done either 40 and 26 across the first and second day. I could have done 33, 33. I could have done 50, 16. I could have even have done, I don't know, one marathon one day, one marathon the next, and still have loose change for the third day. So I didn't know how long it would take me. I knew in my head I could run late 40s, 50 miles in one day, but I didn't know if I could make it through to the second day, because I'd never done it before, and I didn't know how it felt, whether it be a complete nightmare to run on tired legs, or whether in fact it was even possible to put my shoes on again afterwards at the end of having slept overnight and into the second day. But anyway, so that was the planning. The planning was that, and it encompassed doing both the green and the yellow routes of the stations, because there's two main lines through the northeast. My aim was to drive up, and at the time I was living in Bristol, so I drove up the day before. I stayed in a Premier Inn quite close to the end of the route. I didn't book the middle of the night, because that would have been a get out of jail free card. So I left a gap that night, and then I booked in for the night after that I would finish the run, so that I can have a kit before I then drove home again the next day. I thought about flying up to Newcastle Airport, but the timings were a bit sketchy, and let's face it, I was a bit skint at the time, because I'd literally just bought a new flat. I was absolutely brassic at the time. So the concept of flying, having to pay for airport parking, all that malarkey, no chance that wouldn't happen. This was on a bit of a shoestring, to be frank. So anyway, I drove up the night before, got all settled in, went to my Premier Inn, and I think, what was I eating the night before? I think it was noodles, things like noodles and mackerel in a tin for my tea, again, skint. And then on the day of the event, I went to South Hyalton Station, which is the final stop, and I took a ticket to Newcastle Airport, which was the first airport, and it took me possibly about an hour to get there, and I was sipping on my water as I went, and then by the time that I actually got to Newcastle Airport, I was actually busting for wind, so I couldn't find a loo anywhere, so I had to dash behind a hedge at one stage just to go for a wee before I started. But anyway, that's an aside. So I started at Newcastle Airport. It was about 11 in the morning, around about 11 in the morning. There was nobody else around. I don't know where everybody else in the world was, but there we are. So I started from Newcastle Airport. It was a relatively warm day, took me by surprise. I mean, it was on a May bank holiday weekend, but even still, I was expecting more people at that time of day. Perhaps there weren't many flights that day, who knows. So anyway, I left the metro station, went out, and it was really quite warm, and I was starting to get slightly worried because it was really quite warm. And after about 2 or 3 miles, I was feeling slightly dehydrated, so I was sipping water, and it was really quite warm, really quite warm. I was getting a bit kind of, oh my god, what have I taken on here? Have I chosen the wrong day to do this? But it was okay. I think it was just the sheer fact that I was running on a lot of tarmac, and tarmac reflects the heat off. So anyway, I carried on through to the town, going in through the suburbs, because I was self-supported. Then I had to stop at places like Tesco to buy things like sandwiches, and I stopped after about the first 4 miles, and I got a sandwich and a double-decker. I think I got some Lucozade as well, something a bit like that. And so I was chomping as I went along, and I was jogging and eating and what have you, and things were going well. So then you come across the city, and you're crossing the northern suburbs of Newcastle, and then you're piecing your way across towards Tynemouth on the far east of the route. And so I was jogging along, and I even crossed a bit of moorland at one stage for about a mile or so. I mean, I got slightly across that space, but it was fine. I found my way. I got directions in the end from somebody walking his dog. Anyway, I digress. So there we go. I'm plodding along. I managed to pick up some lunch at Teignmouth. Yeah, I think I had a prawn sandwich or something like that, and some crisps and a meal deal. Which I swear blindly that I don't like buying meal deals, but on something like this, then that's fine. That's absolutely fine, because it's just trying to get calories down and what you fancy at the time. It doesn't matter exactly what you eat. Yeah, it's just managing to get calories down. I got slightly lost coming out of that supermarket that time, about the 15-mile point. But then I was back on track again, and I was going down the coast, and then I started going back inland again, and you're going past through some industrial estates, going along, and you could see the river quite a lot of the time on the left as you're going into town, and it was sort of a solid 6, 7, 8 miles along into town, passing through some estates which weren't necessarily 100% great aesthetically. I didn't feel unsafe any of the time, but if I were running there late in the evening or late at night, I may have thought twice. But I was safe enough, and I made it into the centre of town, past places like Byker and, fantastic architecture. Then you go in towards the centre of town, past places like the University of Northumbria, I believe it is, with glass bulbed buildings. And then you go in towards the shop, and it gets very busy, and there's a bit of a vibe going around town. You go up past the football stadium, and then on to Townmoor, and then up towards Jesmond, and then you turn back through the shops again, and then back across the river, over to Gateshead, up a cheeky little hill, up through Gateshead, and then along the south bank, and by that point it was getting very much into the evening, and going 20 into 30 miles, plodding along, and you get into the point which you're thinking, shall I call it a day for the evening? Shall I find somewhere to sleep? And you start subconsciously trying to scope out where you're going to sleep, where you're going to spend the night. And so you start looking at trees, green spaces, areas might be soft underground. And there was one particular stop, and it was, I'd say it's a couple of miles out of South Shields, and there was this green space with these trees, and I thought, oh, fantastic, that looks great, that looks absolutely spot on, because it was a very quiet industrial estate, green space around. But over the other way, I spotted these people moving around, and I think that it was either people doing drugs or there are prostitutes where they were taking people for sex, basically. And I think it was the latter. So I had to jog on through. And so it did start to get quite dark by this point, and I was thinking, oh God, I really have got to find somewhere to crash, because I was getting a bit knackered by then, truth be told. And it was getting into the 40-mile point, and so I picked up a whole load of water, because of course you can't just nip to your hotel bathroom to get a glass of water at night. You have to be loaded up with water for the end of the day and the start of the next day and for overnight. So I picked up a whole load of water at a petrol station, and then I started running back inland from South Shields. And I got towards, I think it was about a couple of miles back inland of South Shields, and I just found this bank before a roundabout, and there were these hedges at the top. I just thought, yeah, that's it, I'm just gonna sleep there. And I used my lightweight sleeping bag, very tiny thing, fit in my backpack. Lightweight sleeping bag was out, lightweight puffer was on. I used my trainers as a pillow, and I put my head down and tried to go to sleep. Now, my experience was this: if you set out to go to sleep by just before a roundabout, A, it's next to a road, B, you will have cars passing by at regular intervals, and C, therefore you will not sleep. So I didn't sleep particularly well, but I did lay down for 3 hours. I may have napped off a couple of times. It wasn't the world's most fantastic sleep in the world, but at least I had a bit of a rest. So I woke up about, I suppose I must have nodded off about midnight, and then I went, well, the aim was to go to sleep about 10:30, but I don't think I nodded off before midnight. And then I woke up again about 3:30. Well, I was probably lying around well before 3, but anyway, I decided to get up. That's when I get up, at 3:30. And so I go down the bank, I put on my puffer, because it was slightly chilly at 3:30 in the morning, truth be told. And so there I was pottering off, I was just jogging along the road. And that was the start of day 2. I did carry on. You can run on day 2. It was a bit sketchy at first, it was a bit tight, slightly uncomfortable, but shuffle, 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 you could actually start again. And then I thought, I can do this, I'm going to give this a bash. Now at this point, I think I'd run about 48 miles the day before, so I had possibly 15-16 miles left of the second day. I thought, okay, that's just over half a marathon in the park run. Let's give it a bash, let's just see how I go, because if all else fails, I can just jump at a flipping metro station. They aren't too far away, because at the end of the day I'm running in between lots of metro stations. It'll be fine. I can just walk away, get a train, back to the finish, back to my primary. And I did finish. And this is what happened. I jogged along a dual carriageway, and we were going past the docks for a couple of miles, and then you go inland towards somewhere called Heyburn, Haben. Please excuse my pronunciation, those who come from the northeast. Anyway, I was going alongside a dual carriageway and something weird happened. I was jogging along, jog, and this person came from lying down in this long grass to sat bolt upright. I thought, what the fuck? And he literally sat up, and then he got up. And I think what it was is that he'd been out the night before, and he just crashed out in the grass. And then he suddenly started walking towards a bus stop. And I thought, oh my god, it scared the shit out of me. So anyway, that was slightly scary, and so I started running really fast away from him because I didn't know what his game was. But he was literally just getting up to get the first bus home, I think. So I was jogging along, further on the dual carriageway. And then I started turning back towards Sunderland at that point. And then it gets to be a lot more rural for about 3-4 miles. So you start seeing things like fences, fields, horses, like the mist in the morning as the sun's coming up. All those kind of countryside-y things that you wouldn't have expected to see on a run like this. So then we go through the other side of the countryside and I started to see the first sign for Sunderland on the outside of Sunderland at the start of the county boundary, and I was like, yeah, and I took a photo just as I was going into Sunderland town, so that was fantastic. So at that point I was like, thank God for that. I've arrived at Sunderland. It's not the end by any stretch of the imagination, because I still had about, 10 miles to go. But I was homeward. So then I came towards the coast again and back towards the Stadium of Light, in towards Sunderland Centre, and by that time it was probably 6-7 in the morning. There was absolutely no other bugger around apart from a road sweeper. Granted, I wasn't expecting much at that time of morning, maybe 1 or 2 people, but slightly surprised that there was nobody knocking around. And then you turn right and you follow the station line going out towards the finish, so I had about 3 or 4 stations to go. I have to admit the last couple of miles are a bit shuffly. It's starting to get slightly painful, because no matter the distance that you run or race, it's always the final mile that tortures your feet. And I was absolutely fine until that last mile. And then at that last mile, my feet were saying to me, right, you've run a long way now, we're going to give you some jip. And so that last mile was particularly uncomfortable. But once I got over the finish, back to Southampton station, back to my car, I sat there, took a sigh of relief and thought, job done, absolutely job done. First thing I did is reached over to my tube of Pringles and started scoffing in them. And I sat down for a little bit, had a little bit of a rest. Yeah, I was a bit kind of buzzing, but not psycho buzzing. I was just running on the adrenaline still of going on the run. And I just had a little sit down for half an hour and just take stock of everything that had just happened. And then I went back to my hotel area. So that was my run in the northeast. It was quite an interesting run, and the response I had from people afterwards was quite surprising. People thought that I was completely potty. Some asked me, was it worth it? Yeah, I think it was, because I saw a side of the city that you wouldn't ever see just as a tourist or just even as a resident. You saw back lanes, you saw estates, you saw the river, you saw landmarks, you saw great architecture, you saw scabby architecture, you saw wildlife, you saw horses, you saw many, many cats, dogs, people, all the things that make a city and bring a city to life. And one of the greatest things, I suppose, is that you've seen all of that within a 24-hour period. I mean, I started at 11 a.m. the day before and I finished at 7 in the morning, all within 24 hours. I mean, who sees that much of life in 24 hours? It's incredible. Would I do it again? Probably not, because there are plenty of other adventures that I could be doing. Would I recommend somebody else to do it? Well, yeah, of course. I mean, it's a great little adventure. It's a pocket adventure. And if you want me to share the route, more than happy to do so. It's very accessible, and at the end of the day, if it all gets a bit much, or you get a bit bored of it all, then just jump on a metro train. Job done. So yeah, great little adventure. Thank you for listening.